Kia ora koutou, ko David Small tōku ingoa. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I've been a big admirer of Cuba. I like the ambassador. I've got no slides, but I have written down words, which is not that usual for me, but I thought that will keep me focused without too many sidetracks. So I will, and hopefully keep me on time. So, for my entire life, Cuba's been an inspiration to the world. The Cuban people were able to liberate themselves from extreme forms of exploitation and domination. And they were able to sustain that revolution for decades in the face of extraordinary opposition, economic sanctions, military aggression, and constant political pressure. The form of exploitation the Cuban Revolution overthrew was common to countries of the global South. Countries previously we used to refer to as the Third World. There's no perfect term for it. Let's call them the global South. Right through the 1960s and 70s and 80s. In many different countries, revolutionary movements sought to emulate Cuba's achievements, but very few succeeded. In Nicaragua, there was a successful revolution, but they were unable to withstand the level of opposition and sabotage and attacks that they were subjected to. Others found electoral ways to come to power, only to find extraordinary attacks and obstruction from the US, right to the point of the demonstration of the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro that we've all witnessed. But Cuba survived. Cuba survived the Cold War era when it was right on the doorstep of Western imperialism. Cuba survived this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as an indication of how profound and distorting the media and the education system is that we've grown up in. I only recently found out the background to this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was what we're told is that this was the Soviet Union moving missiles into Cuba in this big, provocative, aggressive move against the United States. But what I only found out recently is that that was in response to the United States doing that in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. It wasn't an initiative just like that, but that's not the story that we're all told. So Cuba survived all that. It survived the end of the Cold War as well, which saw the US emerge as the sole global superpower, and the emergence of what's been called the unipolar era. In this unipolar era, the US exerted its power all over the world, politically, militarily, and economically. A major aspect of this was the global imposition of neoliberalism. This model of deregulated capitalism was forced on the whole world, and particularly on countries of the global South. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank used the indebtedness of countries to force them to adopt what were called structural adjustment policies. This was a package of neoliberal policies that required countries to open their economies to maximum penetration and exploitation by global capital, forcing them to float their currencies, remove tariffs, remove subsidies, basically leave them open to any sort of economic exploitation. The plan was to create a global deregulated economy that would allow capital to move freely across national borders to settle wherever it could find maximum possibilities of exploitation and to relocate at the first sign of trouble. Since colonial times, national economies of colonies have been organised so that they would favour the development of the colonial power at the expense of the colonised people. But neoliberal globalisation greatly intensified the possibilities for this form of exploitation. and it was accompanied by weakening the political power and autonomy of nation states. Their economies became beholden to the whim of international capital and financiers. For decades, we saw the intensification of exploitation and extraction and the creation of economic systems that would transfer wealth from the poor to the rich. The system that transferred wealth from the poor to the rich became more and more entrenched, and the level of inequality between rich and poor, both within countries and internationally between countries, widened dramatically. At the same time, as the collective West was pushing these systems of economic exploitation, the US was also flexing its military muscle. The first big military confrontation of the unipolar era, the post-Cold War era, was the invasion of Iraq. Here we saw the US, backed by the collective West, fabricate the story about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction in order to justify their predetermined decision to invade and destroy Iraq. The world saw for the first time laser-guided Tomahawk missiles delivering massive explosive power with pinpoint accuracy. It was a demonstration to the world that, in the words of George Bush at the time, what we say goes. So we were in a period of unipolar power where the United States was the sole superpower, the sole hegemon in the world. It advanced its economic interests by pushing neoliberalism, and it advanced its political and strategic interests by overwhelming military power. The US made the rules. It required the rest of the world to follow the rules, and if there was any risk that these rules might be questioned or transgressed, it would use or threaten the use of overwhelming military power to force the transgressor to abide by the rules. This is what they called the rules-based order. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, this unipolar world with the US as the global hegemon has started to come unstuck. Economically, it's being challenged by the rise of China. China is one of the few countries in the world where the US was unable to impose neoliberalism. The effect of that was that China did not lose control over the direction and strategies of its economic development. And it chose strategies that were not only designed to assist development in China, but also that would ensure that it was not so vulnerable to the vagaries of international markets or the pressure and bullying and domination of the United States. The US tried to impede and obstruct China's development by imposing economic sanctions, by putting on technological boycotts, and by political pressure by any means they could think of. And last year, Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on most countries in the world, including its American allies. Countries that had been locked into the neoliberal model were extremely vulnerable to this sort of pressure, and many of them were forced to buckle. But China stared down the US threats, and in Busan last November, after the APEC meeting, at the most recent meeting of President Xi and President Trump, Trump was forced to back down. China threw him a few soybean purchases so he could pretend it wasn't a back down, but everybody knew that it was, including Trump. He ended up agreeing a tariff rate for China that was the same as what he agreed with the EU, who were supposed to be US allies. The bipolar world ended with Gorbachev agreeing to dismantle the Soviet Union. I think the unipolar era of American hegemony ended with Trump backing down in China. That was the end of the universal hegemony of neoliberalism. China had become too economically strong and self-reliant to be forced into submission. Politically, I think the beginning of the end of the unipolar era happened in Gaza. It was the inhumane, depraved, murderous, indefensible genocide in Gaza that fundamentally altered and I think permanently destroyed any moral authority that the collective West might previously have had. The whole world could see the inhumane, genocidal slaughter. And while we were watching it, every Western leader was telling us that what we could see was not actually happening. An extraordinary attempt at global gaslighting, and one that failed completely. It failed so badly that one of those leaders, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who Josephine referred to, eventually let the cat out of the bag. He confessed that everything progressives had been saying over the last decades was correct, that the political and economic and military objectives of the collective West had been entirely oriented to advance their own interests at the expense of the poor and the weak, while trying to disguise this naked self-interest. Carney admitted that they were only ever pretending to stand for democracy and freedom and justice. They were actually all in it for themselves. And now we have the attack on Iran. Given the genocide and the Carney confession, the world now knows 100% without any doubt that the purpose of this attack had nothing to do with the well-being of the people of Iran. The political damage the US has suffered is now making it incredibly difficult for Trump to get any significant support for this outrageous attack. But most significantly, what we're seeing in Iran is the end, I think, of US military hegemony. During the unipolar era, the US was able to destroy countries, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all countries that US was able to attack, cause massive damage, topple governments, and leave them in a complete mess. And in most instances, it was able to do this without suffering significant damage itself. They were so dominant that even the threat of attack would usually suffice. Trump thought he could do this to Iran as well. He was hoping that the destruction of the Iranian state would happen within a matter of days. But he's failed dramatically. Operation Epic Fury is looking increasingly like Operation Epic Fail. The US will not achieve its objectives, and the longer it persists with this war, the worse the outcome for the collective West will be, and the worse the outcome for the US will be. So what we see, I think, is that we're entering a new world order, a multipolar world order, one where US Western hegemony is no longer the uncontested power of the world. They have lost their political standing and moral authority. They've lost their economic domination, and they've lost their military invincibility. So we're transitioning from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, although what form that takes is still emerging. But one thing is clear, and that is that the countries of the global south will be leading this transition. Countries of the global south are not a homogenous bloc, but we can see in them, in all of them, attempts to build and maintain genuine alternatives to the current political and economic models that all have their origin in colonial domination and exploitation. Cuba is a key part of this. Alongside Palestinians and Iranians, Cubans are the heroes of the resistance. Palestine, Iran, and Cuba have defied US imperialism. They have given people hope and inspiration. Cuba has consistently stood with and supported people in struggle throughout the world, in South and Central America, in Southern Africa, particularly in the frontline states in the fight against apartheid, and in West Asia, notably with the Palestinians. The Cuban people have endured enormous suffering, but they have stood up against this aggression from the US and its allies, all while maintaining an extraordinary internationalist orientation. Right now, Cuba is in the crosshairs. After Trump's back down to Xi in Busan last year, the US released a national security doctrine where it emphasized that its main priority will be the domination and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere. Just a few weeks ago, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, again the photo that we saw before, delivered an extraordinary speech at the Munich Security Conference. In it, he praised European colonisation and called for a reassertion of European authority over the whole world. And Rubio is obsessed with destroying Cuba. The US is obsessed, and Rubio is particularly obsessed personally. For decades, Cuba has stood as an inspiration to progressive people all over the world. Now it's time for us to recognise that and to offer whatever solidarity and support that we can. The Trump administration is showing that as the US empire crumbles, it will act compulsively, irrationally, violently, unlawfully. It's time for the world to stand with Cuba, and for us here in Aotearoa, it's essential that we do whatever we can to make sure that New Zealand is not linked to this declining empire and instead stands for a new world based on peace, justice and freedom. Kia ora.